She had been awake for 2 days. Not all of it weeping. Some of it was the hollow, airless stillness that comes after weeping runs out. The kind of grief that doesn't make a sound because it's settled too deep for sound to reach. Miriam of Magdala left the upper room before the city woke, before the first bread sellers lit their fires, before the roosters had anything to say about it. She carried 3 spice jars wrapped against her body, and she walked through streets that still smelled of Passover lamb and the distant smoke of everything she'd watched happen 3 days ago. Jerusalem in the pre-dawn dark is a different city. The gates open at first light, not before. The soldiers patrol in pairs. She kept her head down and her steps quiet, and she told herself she wasn't afraid, which was only partly true. The stone. I hadn't thought about the stone. She had been so focused on what she'd do once she got inside the tomb that she'd never quite worked out the first problem. A stone that size takes a dozen men and a strong morning. She was one woman with 3 jars of spice. She'd figure it out when she got there. She always did. 3 years she had followed him, from the hills above the sea in Galilee to the crowded roads of Judea. She'd heard him teach in synagogues where the officials had never spoken to a woman, and she'd watched those same women listen as if hearing water for the first time after years of thirst. She'd been one of them. She knew what it felt like. And now she was carrying spice jars through a dark street in a city that had just executed him because there was nothing else left to do. 3 blocks from where she walked, a man named Natan was pacing outside the high priest's residence, waiting for the guard rotation report. He was 32 years old, junior enough to be given this assignment, senior enough to understand what would happen to everyone if the situation became complicated. He had coordinated the Roman guard himself, a seal on the stone, 4 soldiers rotating watch. It was excessive. He knew it was excessive. But Caiaphas had been very specific. There must be no possibility of the disciples claiming the body was taken and the man risen. This is how you end a movement. You make sure the body stays where you put it. The guard rotation report was late. Natan was still pacing. In the house 3 streets south of the Temple Mount, the upper room held 11 men who had barely spoken in 48 hours. They'd bolted the door on the first night. Not paranoia exactly, pragmatism. They had watched what happened to someone who disagreed with the high priest and the Romans in the same week, and they were aware of being very findable. Shimon Kepha, Peter, sat against the far wall with his knees pulled up and his eyes on the stone floor. He had denied knowing Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. He had said the words, out loud, to the face of a servant girl with a charcoal fire, and then he had gone outside and wept as if his chest were being emptied. Yochanan sat near the window, not sleeping, watching the sky above the city rooftops for the first change of color that would tell him morning was coming.
She went alone. She actually went alone.
He'd known Miriam was going. She hadn't asked permission. She'd just taken the spice jars she'd prepared and gone. And Yochanan, the youngest, the fastest, the one who'd stood at the foot of the cross because he was young enough not to calculate consequences, was sitting by a window instead of going with her. He would think about this for the rest of his life. The Kidron Valley Road between the city and the Garden of Tombs runs through a stretch of ancient olive trees. On a clear morning, you can see the trees from the city walls. Enormous, gnarled, silver-leafed, older than anyone alive. On a dark morning with fog in the valley, you can only feel them on either side of you. The weight of their presence, the cold that pools under their canopy.
Miriam walked this road in the dark, her sandals on the stones, the fog thinning at the edges. The city beginning the first sounds of waking behind her.
She came around the final bend in the path and stopped.
The stone was gone. Not aside, not rolled to the edge of the groove.
Gone. Moved fully away from the entrance, 10 feet from where it had been sealed. The entrance to the tomb was open, black inside, the garden silent. And the guard. 4 soldiers, a Roman seal, all of it gone, as if the whole apparatus had simply stopped existing overnight.
They've taken him. They've taken him out.
She stood at the entrance for 3 full seconds. Didn't go in. Couldn't. Then she turned and ran back toward the city, faster than she'd come. The spice jars rattling against her body, the fog parting around her, the first gray light of dawn beginning at the far edge of the eastern sky. She ran because there was nothing else she knew to do. She'd been wrong about the stone. She'd been wrong about being ready. And now she was wrong about something she couldn't name yet. Something that made the open darkness of that tomb feel less like an ending and more like a question she didn't have the vocabulary for. The stone was gone. The tomb was open. And in the upper room, where 11 men were pretending to sleep, a young man named Yohanan was still watching the window, and the first pale edge of dawn was just now arriving. She came through the gate and didn't stop running until she was in the stairwell of the merchant's house, pounding on the upper room door with both hands. The bolt pulled back. Yohanan was already on his feet. He'd heard her coming up the street. Peter was behind him, slower, heavier, eyes dark with something deeper than sleep. Yohanan went first, and the man is fast. Younger legs, lighter conscience, less weight to carry. He reached the garden path at a dead run and arrived at the tomb entrance while Peter was still 40 yards back, lungs working hard. Yohanan stooped at the entrance and looked in. He saw the linen cloths lying there. Just lying there. He did not go inside. He stood at the opening and breathed. When Peter arrived, flushed, furious at his own body for slowing down, he went straight in. No pause, no threshold hovering, just in. The burial linens, the full length of them, the sindon, lying flat where the body had been, as if the body had simply ceased to be inside them without disturbing the shape. And the headcloth, the sudarion, not mixed with the other linens, not discarded in a corner, folded, set apart, in a place by itself. Peter stood in that cold, dark, myrrh-scented space and looked at folded fabric and didn't know what to do with what he was seeing. Robbers don't fold. Yohanan came in after him. He looked, and the gospel he would write decades later says simply, he saw and he believed. But even the writer of that gospel admits they still didn't understand what had happened. They saw the evidence. The belief was ahead of the understanding. That's how it works sometimes. They walked back to the city. They left Miriam in the garden. She hadn't gone inside with them. She'd stood at the entrance and watched them go in and watched them come back out with faces she couldn't read. And when they walked past her back toward the road, she didn't follow. She stayed. No reason to stay. Every reason to stay. She stayed because she didn't know what else to do, and she was out of alternatives, and the body she'd come to anoint wasn't here, and she was going to cry about it in this specific location until someone told her what had happened to him. She stooped to look into the tomb, and there were two figures inside, seated, one where the head had been, one where the feet had been, dressed in something she couldn't quite account for, and one of them spoke.
Woman, why are you weeping?
She straightened and turned. Instinct, or something that moved faster than instinct. Someone was standing in the garden behind her. She thought, gardener, the man who tends these grounds at dawn, checking on things before the heat comes. That was the logical explanation. She'd been wrong about the stone, wrong about the guard, wrong about the robbers. The logical explanation felt safer than whatever her thoughts were starting to suggest. He said one word. One word. Her name. Mary. She knew. Before her mind caught up, before she could construct an explanation for how the voice was the voice it was, she knew. The way you know a voice you've heard every day for 3 years. The way you know a word spoken in a specific way that no one else has ever used. Not gardener, not stranger. Teacher! The word came out of her like something that had been held under pressure for too long. She reached for him, and the moment is told in the gospel as gently as anything in scripture. He said, "Don't hold on to me yet. I haven't ascended to the Father yet. Go, tell the brothers." So she ran again. But this time, the running was different. Every cell of her body running towards something instead of away from it. If you've ever felt like the story you were part of had finished, like what you built your life on had been put in the ground, stay with us. This is where that assumption gets taken apart. Subscribe to Faithful Tales so you don't miss what the next witnesses experienced before they could believe what Miriam was about to tell them, because their response was not what you'd hope. Meanwhile, Natan was in full crisis management mode. The 4 soldiers of the Roman guard had been found scattered and incoherent near the garden, unable to give a coherent account of what had happened to them or how the seal had been broken without their knowledge. Natan had done the math very quickly. If the soldiers reported what they'd actually experienced, Rome would have them executed for dereliction of duty. If the religious authorities reported that the body had been taken by disciples, the whole story of a resurrection started circulating. Neither outcome was acceptable. Tell them you fell asleep. It's the worst outcome, but it's the survivable one. Money for the trouble. If this gets to the governor, we'll handle it. It was a good lie. Functional, it would circulate for years. And Miriam of Magdala was running toward 11 men in a locked room to tell them what she had seen, with not a single piece of evidence except her own face, her own voice, and one word spoken to her in a garden.
She would tell them and they would not believe her. Not because they were cruel, because it was too much. Because the mind protects itself from things that would shatter it completely. Because they had been to the cross, and the cross had been very clear.
She knocked on the door and she told them everything.
They didn't believe her, not even close.
The gospel accounts say her words seemed to them like nonsense. 11 men, a woman in emotional extremity, and a story that the human mind simply has no pre-existing category for. They weren't wrong to be careful. They were wrong to dismiss her. Thomas wasn't there. He'd gone to buy bread and hadn't come back, which, in retrospect, seems very Thomas. He would hear the account later, with the expression of a man being told his sane friends had started a rumor they'd all be executed for. He was not opposed to miracles. He was opposed to rumors about miracles. He considered himself very good at telling the difference.
Through the upper room walls, Jerusalem was talking.
2 versions of the story circulating by mid-morning. The disciples took the body while the guards slept, or, whispered growing, the tomb was empty and nobody knew why. Natan was working hard to make version 1 dominant. That's what bribed soldiers and a well-organized institution can usually manage. Usually. The disciples spent the day behind the locked door. Every knock made someone reach for the nearest solid object. And then, evening. First stars, the lamps low, the door still bolted.
He was there. No door opened, no window, nobody let him in.
He was simply there, standing in the room. The room that was bolted. The room where 11 men were sitting in their fear like men who had forgotten what non-fear felt like. He showed them his hands. He showed them his side. And the Gospel of John says they rejoiced when they saw him, which is one of the great understatements in the history of literature. 10 men who had been functionally unable to breathe correctly for 60 hours suddenly had to learn how to breathe again, all at once, in a room that had no adequate size for what was happening in it. He gave them something then. A charge, a commission, the same thing he'd said to Miriam in the garden. Go, tell. The movement was not over. It had just changed completely. They were no longer followers waiting for the next teaching. They were witnesses to the most contested fact in the world, and their job was to go say what they'd seen. Thomas wasn't there. Of course Thomas wasn't there. When the others told him, later, probably around a meal Thomas had finally shown up for, his answer was measured and completely in character. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, I will not believe. If you're here on Faithful Tales, subscribe. There are more chronicles to tell, more rooms that couldn't stay locked, more names spoken in gardens. A week later, the group was together again. Thomas, this time, actually in the room, actually present. The door was locked again, and then it wasn't a problem, again. Jesus turned to Thomas with something that reads, across 2,000 years and multiple translations, as enormous patience.
I will not believe. He will come again. He promised.
Thomas looked at the hands. He looked at the side. And something happened in him that required no further argument.
Is it truly him? He has returned. Toma, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand.
8 words from the man who had demanded physical evidence. The man who'd called everyone else credulous and emotional. The most skeptical voice in the room and the most complete declaration of belief in the gospel. Jesus said, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Here's what the early church understood that the world has been debating ever since. These witnesses were offered the chance to recant and survive. Several of them would be offered that trade face to face with a weapon involved and a way out clearly marked. Not one of them took it. Peter, who had denied 3 times, would be crucified upside down decades later for refusing to stop saying what he'd seen. Thomas, who had demanded evidence, carried the testimony as far as India. Miriam of Magdala would be called by the early church apostle to the apostles. The one who told the ones who told the world. In the street below the upper room, Shimon of Cyrene heard the doors flung open, feet on the stairs, voices that sounded like people who'd been drowning and had just remembered there was air. He pressed himself to the wall as they came out. 11 men and a woman, moving like people who suddenly had somewhere to be. He watched them go. Standing there in the morning light, something shifted in him. A weight he'd been carrying since the hill, since the crossbeam lifting. He couldn't have said why. He didn't have the language for it yet. The spice jars Miriam had carried to the garden were found later, unopened. The body they'd been brought for didn't need them. The best she had to offer, the most she could think to give, unnecessary. Not because her love was too small, because the story was too large for it.
They are gone.
A folded cloth, an open door, a name spoken by a voice she thought she'd never hear again. 3 witnesses with no reason to invent it and every reason to stay quiet. The tomb was empty, and the chronicle goes on.